Some chose to jump into the waters infested with sharks rather than feel that iron. Now, once they arrived on this very soil, they were forced to work by way of the whip, despite being starved, sleep-deprived, threatened, tortured, physically and psychologically. They were auctioned off, humiliated, fearful, and separated from their families and their children. Black women and girls were raped and sexually assaulted. Many were brutally murdered and mutilated.
Donald Trump is now targeting the Smithsonian museums over how they present America's history, particularly the history of slavery, and the debate surrounding it is getting heated. In this clip, Phillip and the panel debate whether America should focus more on its progress or continue confronting the darkest parts of its history. But as the conversation develops, they also tackle a much bigger question. Can America truly understand how far it has come without honestly teaching people about what came before? Now, if you're new here, I'm Bradley Hostin, and this is The Bradley Hostin Show. If you enjoy honest political commentary, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As usual, let's watch the clip, and then I'll give you guys my thoughts afterwards.
Good evening. I'm Phillip in New York. Last week on this show, a guest shocked the table by arguing in part that slavery in America can't just be blamed on one race, and that museums put too much focus on the role of white people who participated in that terrible institution. And now tonight, that same argument is being pushed by the President of the United States. Donald Trump says that one of the reasons for his crackdown on Smithsonian museums is, quote, everything discussed is how bad slavery was. What we try to do on this program is create a platform for discussion and debate that reflects the very real differences that exist in this country. It's what echo chambers in our society fail to do, frankly. But on this topic, it's important to say objectively, slavery was indeed bad. It was evil, the nation's original sin. And it is impossible to understand the true history of this country without fully grappling with slavery's impact. Simply because of their birthplace and the color of their skin, the bodies and spirits of Black men, women, and children were exploited for profit and power. They were forced onto ships, bound by shackles and collars that ripped off their skin. One older man described it as iron entering our souls. Some chose to jump into the waters infested with sharks rather than feel that iron. Now, once they arrived on this very soil, they were forced to work by way of the whip, despite being starved, sleep-deprived, threatened, tortured, physically and psychologically. They were auctioned off, humiliated, fearful, and separated from their families and their children. Black women and girls were raped and sexually assaulted. Many were brutally murdered and mutilated. Now, this endured for decades, centuries. And even in the places where slavery was not legal, institutions from our banks to universities were built on enslaved labor in both the North and in the South. And for many of the white Americans who did not personally own slaves, they benefited from a caste system that concentrated wealth and political power in their hands. So, when we acknowledge the existence of Black people who operated George Washington's Mount Vernon or the Black hands that built the White House, we are acknowledging the existence, the perseverance, and the contributions of the souls that white supremacy sought to erase. Those people built families, they developed a culture, they were the keepers of the faith, cultivators of community. And they are the ones who deserve credit for forcing America to rid itself of the stain of slavery. Now, all of this information, these stories are from the Smithsonian's African American History Museum. And I share this not as a lecture for you, but as a lesson. America, the superpower, is largely possible only because of the superpowers of people who went lifetimes without the same rights of generations who were boosted from their backs. True history should include everything. Yes, the evils and the horrors too. And museums are supposed to be places that protect those stories, the images, the lessons, the very things that inform so much of our current state of our republic, from racism to poverty. No matter how painful, or in the president's words, how horrible the lesson. Now, just listen to one formerly enslaved man describe what slavery is like in his own words.
You know what I'd rather do? If I thought that I'd ever be a slave again, I'd take a gun and just end it all right away. Because you're nothing but a dog. You're not a thing but a dog.
We are here in the studio with our panel, Leah Wright-Rigueur. I was actually surprised to see President Trump basically saying the quiet part out loud, that this review of the Smithsonian is not about even just something vague about reviewing history to make sure that it's fair. He wants to make it so that it talks less about slavery. What does that say to you?
Well, I think it's an effort. It's part of a larger effort to both sanewash and whitewash American history and essentially erase all of the parts and disappear all of the parts that make Americans, that make President Trump uncomfortable, that feel distasteful, that are a reflection of the actual real and horrific parts of our history. And I find it a little ironic. You know, earlier today, as I was listening to some of the commentary, my first thought was, wait a second. I wonder if the president has actually ever visited any of the Smithsonian museums. And then I remembered that in 2017, he actually took a tour of the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Let me just play, actually, what he said during that tour. Listen to this.
I had the privilege of visiting the National Museum of African American History and Culture right here in Washington, D.C. It's a new, beautiful Smithsonian museum that serves as a shining example of African Americans' incredible contributions to our culture, our society, and our history. It also tells of the great struggle for freedom and equality that prevailed against the sins of slavery and the injustice of discrimination. The work and love of the people who helped create such a masterpiece is a testament to the legacy of so many leaders it honors.
So was it that he didn't believe what he read from the teleprompter as he recorded that video, or what?
You know, I'm really struggling to understand in a lot of ways, particularly given that the tour that he took with director Lonnie Bunch was actually a reflection of really the mastery that and really the care and the patience that historians, that scholars, that curators put into the Museum of African American History and Culture. It is not just about the horrors of slavery, although it tells that very important story. It actually follows this really brilliant model where you move through the museum and it tells the story not just of enslaved Americans in America, but also of the resilience, of the triumph. And in doing so, it tells a story that is very much about democracy and about a quest for democracy and the way that Americans both built this country, but also the story and the narrative of like a truly American experience. And so for the president, I think, to just simply erase that and push that away tells it, particularly after praising it a few years ago, tells us that this is part of a much larger agenda. This is part of a much larger agenda to erase things that really, I think the country is just refuses to deal with and is really uncomfortable with.
He said as much by ending this post with, "This country cannot be woke because woke is broke." He says, "We have to have the hottest country in the world and we want people to talk about it, including our museums." Why is he equating talking about slavery with woke?
Well, look, I think, let me just start this conversation by saying that my personal view is slavery was a reprehensible institution. I agree with your words that it was our original sin. We also fought a war to eradicate it and to get over it as a country. And that was a necessary thing that happened, and a lot of people died, and we did eradicate it, and that's a good thing. I think what he's asking is, in our museums, what defines us? Are we going to be defined by the worst moment or the worst institution or the worst mistake we ever made? Or are we going to be defined by what we've done moving forward to get over it and to become the greatest nation on the earth? My belief is that he wants to look at these museums, not because he wants to do away with the idea that slavery occurred, but that he wants to ask a very simple question. Are we going to present ourselves as being exceptional or not? And I think he believes there is an effort by some to continue to try to define us from our worst moment instead of to try to focus and define us based on our best moments, which started when we eradicated slavery and began to move forward as the light of the world. And so that's what I think.
Museums, that's what makes us an exceptional nation, is because they tell the history and the story of our country, and therefore, you know, these horrible, horrific moments in our history. The original sin, as Abby talked about, when it comes to slavery, has, you know, we of course did eradicate it, but look where we've come today. And I think those museums, like to your point, make America exceptional, and in museums all around the world that document atrocities, whether it be, you know, from Nazi Germany to eradicating slavery here in the United States, you have to learn the lessons of the past, and to deny it is to defend it.
I don't think he's denying it, and Bachi may want to comment on this as well, but I think what he wants to ask is a simple question. As we present our history, are we spending most of our time focused on something terrible? Are we going to spend more time as we enter our 250th anniversary focused on what this country has done to improve the lives of every single person who lives here? We are the light of the world for a reason, because we're an improving commodity.
The question I ask when I hear you say that is, why, I mean, the idea that slavery happened, it's hard to understand what we've overcome if you don't even talk about what it was. You know, I think that kind of waters down the whole.
I don't think anybody is proposing that we ignore that it happened.
I don't think that's accurate. I think that the problem is that there are people, and Scott used the term a couple of times, and I don't think it was meant with any type of ill intent, but he said, you know, we got over it. And I think that's the problem. I think that there are a lot of people in this country who believe that for some reason we got over it. I mean, the fact is that American chattel slavery is vastly different than what Jillian Michaels and others talk about when they talk about slavery around the world. I mean, the chattel slavery system that we had was extremely transactional. It was actually codified in law, and it was based upon the color and race, as you so eloquently pointed out in your opening. And so not only when you think about that portion of where we are, 26 of our first 30 Supreme Court justices owned slaves. The people who are on our money every single day owned slaves. United States presidents, members of the United States Congress owned slaves. Lehman Brothers, we're not far from Wall Street, owned slaves. Brooks Brothers suits that we wear owned slaves. So not only are we talking about the epicenter and the foundation of where our country was built, we have to acknowledge that. But even more importantly, and this is where I believe that Scott and I can find agreement on this issue. Breon and Megan Walker are two of my best friends in the world. Their dad was the first African-American SGA president at the University of South Carolina, right? He was an exec at IBM, but he was one of the first, right? We're still talking about first that emerged and stood on those shoulders. I tell the story often about my mom and dad. My mom helped desegregate high schools. In Hamilton High School in Memphis, Tennessee, my dad shot in the Orangeburg Massacre. This is a part of my story. This isn't some faint, distant history. Yeah. And so the reason I bring that up is because I think that American exceptionalism talks about the fact that Black folk enslaved folk help build this country for what it is. Mm-hmm. They built Washington, D.C., but all of us are around this table. Abby, myself, all of us, not just Abby and myself, all of us are around this table because of the sacrifices and the blood and the sweat and the tears these people poured in.
I also come back to why the focus so much on slavery when it comes to rewriting history. There's a lot of history that it's in these museums, but he's focused on one thing, and that is that there's too much slavery being mentioned in the United States of America. That's very odd, Batia, honestly.
So I want to start by saying I actually agree with everything that's been said, and I loved your opening. And so I offer these comments very humbly because it's an honor to be included in this conversation, which is very solemn, and I think we all understand that, and we are all looking for the common ground here. And so what I'm about to say, I don't mean in any way to negate that tone. But starting around 2011, 2012, sociologists started to notice a shift in white liberal opinion polling to where white progressives became more extreme in their views on race than Black and Hispanic Americans. And they called this, the sociologists did, called it the Great Awakening. And when they postulated, where did this come from? Why did white progressives suddenly start obsessing over race in a way that was actually far to the left of where Hispanic and Black Americans were on this issue? They found that the media had shifted radically how it talked about these issues. So for example, in 2010, the words white supremacy were mentioned 75 times in the Washington Post and the New York Times.
But the media is different from museums.
In 2020, the words white supremacy were mentioned 700 times in the Washington Post and the New York Times and 2,400 times in NPR. The word racism 4,000 times in 2020. The words white and racial privilege from 2013 to 2019 grew by 1,500% in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And the word slavery itself exponentially skyrocketed as a percentage of words. I'm offering this only to suggest.
I understand. I'm just wondering
that.
What do you think is the problem with talking about slavery, white supremacy, racism, et cetera?
So the point I'm trying to make here is that liberals will say, well, this is a reflection of reality. But of course it isn't. This is a reflection of a newfound obsession that was driven by the media. And that doesn't reflect either the moral evil of these things or the historical accuracy.
I do want to dive into what you mean by that, because you say that you don't think it's a reflection of reality. Based on what?
Well,
based on the idea that those things don't exist, that white supremacy doesn't exist, racism doesn't exist, that we shouldn't be talking about it anymore?
Based on the idea, obviously all these things I think are evil, but there's not more slavery now to the tune of
but I think part of the problem,
1,500% than there was
Batya, is that in the
hold
on a second, Bakari. Part of the problem is that back, not that long ago, in the 50s, the 60s, even beyond that, when there was actual Jim Crow happening in this country, people were actually treating Black people as second-class citizens. We weren't talking about those things at all.
But in 2013,
those words were virtually never mentioned.
But Abby, you don't
so is
think
that better? Was it better then, or was it worse?
You don't think that 2013 is the same as the 1960s,
But you're missing,
right?
respectfully, and I've had this debate many times.
Do you really think that there's as big a difference between the 1960s?
But we're missing.
So honestly, I think this was a really important conversation because there's a distinction that needs to be made here. Nobody is saying America hasn't progressed. Of course it has. The America of today is fundamentally different from the America of the 1960s, the 1920s, or the era of slavery. But how are you supposed to understand that progress if you remove the history that explains why that progress was necessary in the first place? That's my biggest problem with the argument that America is somehow obsessed with slavery simply because museums continue to talk about it. Slavery isn't some minor chapter in American history. It shaped the country's economy, politics, institutions, and racial hierarchy for centuries. And I thought Bakari made an especially important point when he explained that the consequences didn't simply disappear when slavery ended. You had Jim Crow, segregation, redlining, discrimination, and the long fight for voting and civil rights. Those things are part of the continuation of that history, and that's why I think the argument that we should simply move on doesn't really work. You can celebrate America's achievements and acknowledge America's failures. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, I would argue that acknowledging the failures makes the achievements more meaningful. If you teach people about slavery, the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, and the struggles that followed, you're not teaching them to hate America, you're teaching them how America changed. And then there's Donald Trump's own history with the Smithsonian's African American History Museum. As we heard in the clip, Trump visited the museum in 2017 and praised it for telling the story of African American contributions, slavery, and the struggle for freedom and equality. So the obvious question is, what changed? Because the history didn't change. The museum didn't suddenly become something completely different. The political environment changed. And I think that's ultimately what this debate is really about. We shouldn't be rewriting history simply because certain parts of that history make people uncomfortable. History isn't supposed to make you comfortable. Sometimes it's supposed to make you uncomfortable. Sometimes it's supposed to make you angry. Sometimes it's supposed to make you ask how something like that was ever allowed to happen. That's how you learn from it. And I actually agree with something that was said toward the end of the discussion. America should have more museums, more books, more education, and more opportunities for people to debate these subjects openly. The answer to uncomfortable history isn't less history. It's better history. Let me know your guys' thoughts down in the comments section below. Do you think America is being honest about its history, or do you think there's now a deliberate effort to downplay some of the country's darkest chapters? As usual, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more news commentaries. I'll see you guys in the next one.